Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative for young readers. Reviews of Comic Squad number 2, Lunch, and Dare to Disappoint, Growing Up in Turkey.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers. I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two people with PhDs talking about comics for young readers.
And on this episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers, we're going to take a look at two new books. Comic Squad Lunch, edited by Jennifer L. Holm and Matthew Holm, and Jarrett J. Krosoczka, I think is right. I'm sorry about that. And we're also going to look at Dare to Disappoint, Growing Up in Turkey by Özge Samanci. But before we go any further, and before I mess up any more names, we'd like for you to know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the fine folks at Discount Comic Book Service. When you go to dcbservice.com, there you can find everything you need for all of your pre-ordering needs. They have DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse titles at 40% off. The other publishers you'll find between 20 and 35% off, and sometimes the specials are 45 to 50% off the cover price. And you know, Gwen, sometimes the discounts are even more than that.
This is true. In fact, this month, there is a great set of bundles for kids. So let's go ahead and get into those so that our readers can think about getting them. They have Marvel Kids Bundle this month that includes issues of Marvel Universe Guardians of the Galaxy number 7, Marvel Universe Ultimate Spider-Man Contest of the Champions number 2, and Marvel Universe Avengers Assemble Civil War number 2. And you can get those three titles for just $4.47, which is 50% off of the cover price. They also have a DC Kids bundle, which is a great value. They have Looney Tunes number 230, which tells you how long Looney Tunes have been around. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You number 68, and Teen Titans Go number 15. Again, all for $4.47. Again, 50% off. So there's 6 comics that you could get this month for under $10. So that's pretty exciting.
That's some great deals. I mean, you can't afford not to go to DCB Service and just look around and see all those great deals. Wow. I know, Gwen, that you're excited about the Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, I am. And, you know, if you need any sort of help, I mean, all these comics are pretty exciting and action-adventure oriented. But if you're having trouble staying awake, there's something else that might be fun, too.
You know, Gwen, you're right. I'm glad you brought that up because at the Comics Alternative, we have another sponsor besides DCB Service, a sponsor that might appeal more to our grown-up listeners, but hey, if you got a younger reader that is into coffee and tea, that's fine too. I'm talking about Just Coffee Co-op. And Just Coffee Co-op is a company that offers 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified coffee. Just Coffee Co-op's coffee is roasted in small batches, so there's no mass production. Everything is made to order. And Just Coffee Co-op is a cooperative, and in addition to the worker-focused nature of the business, they're also socially conscious. There's no minimum order, and the shipping is absolutely free. And all you need to do is to go to their website, which is justcoffee.coop, C-O-O-P. And when you check out, you can use our coupon code COMICS. That's all caps, C-O-M-I-C-S. When you do that, that's going to give you a 10% off your order, and it's going to help support the Comics Alternative podcast, which is a good thing to do.
Absolutely. And, they also have chocolate. For those of us who don't drink coffee but love chocolate, they have Divine Chocolate, which is organic and also, very ethical choice. So, and I love putting coffee and ethics together. That's exciting. That is a great combination. And so you can order that there too, by the bar or by the box. So head on over there because it sounds like a great deal. You can get all amped up to read your comics.
Definitely. And Gwen, we got two really, really good comics to talk about today. The first one we got is for the younger crowd, and this is called Comic Squad Lunch. And this is edited by Jennifer L. Holm and Matthew Holm and Jarrett Krosoczka. I hope I got that right. It's published by Random House. And if those names sound familiar, Jennifer Holm and Matthew Holm, it might be because you heard Gwen and I discuss their excellent graphic novel several months back, Sunny Side Up, which is just a treasure. And they also do some other work too, which we'll talk about as we get into the series. And also Jarrett J. Krosoczka is the creator of the Lunch Lady series. We'll be talking about that a little bit more later too.
Oh, lunch in grade school and middle school. I have so many memories, don't you?
Oh, aren't they all wonderful memories too?
I will tell you one thing. It's very difficult to get mustard out of clothing. Let's just leave it at that.
Gwen, it's funny because my wife and I, we were vacationing in San Francisco recently, and one of the things that we did was we went to Alcatraz, and one of the places inside Alcatraz they took us was the cafeteria. Where all the prisoners ate. And I was thinking, school was just about this bad.
Oh, boy.
It wasn't that much different. Although, I don't think we had criminals. Maybe criminals.
Future criminals.
Criminals
possibly.
in training.
Yes.
But,
I guess it depends on where you went to school.
Yeah, and who you had lunch with. You could learn a lot. But we digress. Anyway, Comic Squad Lunch is an anthology comic, and for those who might be unfamiliar with that term, an anthology is a group of works, whether they're in comics or prose, that are usually by different authors, but they're stories sharing a common theme, like The Best American Mysteries or maybe an anthology of ghost stories. This differs from a collection, which is usually stories by one author. And sometimes people, including myself, get a little confused with the terms. But Comic Squad Lunch is a new anthology of stories, comic stories, based around a single topic, lunch. So all of the stories deal in some way with lunch. Now, Gwen, some readers may have read the first anthology in this series, which was called Comic Squad Recess, which came out a couple of years ago, which, oddly enough, the stories were about recess.
Okay.
Imagine that. And it was created by the same people that put this together, the Holmes, Jennifer and Matthew Holm, and also Jarrett Krosoczka. They edited that too. Now, some of the people that were in that first book that had comics in that first book are back for a second or more stories. But, we also have some brand new people too, and that's really exciting. So I'm just going to kind of just go down the line of who we have in this anthology, and then we can talk a little bit more in detail about the particular stories.
Sure.
Some of the creators we have, the first creator is C.C. Bell, who, of course, did the wonderful book El Defo, which is I think a favorite of both of ours.
Right.
Jason Shiga, who you may not know, but you should. We'll talk about him a little bit later too. Then we've got a story by Cecil Castellucci and Sarah Varon, who also produced Robot Dreams, Odd Duck, and actually they've got a new book, Gwen, that you and I were talking about, I think, off mic last time, called Sweater Weather and Other Stories.
Right, those are ones that Sarah's done on her own.
Oh, those are just Sarah.
Yeah, those are just Sarah, but that's okay. The thing that people know probably Castellucci for The Plain Janes, which was a YA novel that came out about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And she often collaborates with artists to do comics. So that's probably where you've heard her. But here, obviously, she's collaborating with Sarah Varon. And that's exciting to have them both together because she's a great writer and Sarah's a great illustrator. So it's an exciting combination.
Yeah, all of those combinations that they have produced, I've been really, really pleased with and impressed with. We also have a story by Jeffrey Brown, who has written several Star Wars-related books, like Darth Vader and Son and Vader's Little Princess, and which is just wonderful. And he's also done the Jedi Academy books, which are super popular. And we also have Nathan Hale from Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales, and we've spoken about him before.
And he's one of your favorites, so that's exciting.
Definitely one of my favorites. And then Jarrett Krosoczka, his Lunch Lady series, he has a story in there too. So, Gwen, do you want to take a look at some of the individual stories in there? Did you have any favorites?
Well, I did. I had one that I'd like to talk about more for the way it looks than even its content. I'll say that generally I thought that this series captured one of the biggest anxieties that kids have approaching the midday, and that is going into the lunchroom and figuring out where to sit, and then also will they have someone to eat with, and will people, accept what they're eating? I mean, all these things that we probably remember from grade school especially came to play in these, and so it was really enjoyable to read them. But what I liked, one that really stuck out to me was The Case of the Missing Science Project.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Was that one of your favorites
that
too?
That was my favorite.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't want to steal your thunder on it.
No. Go ahead and tell us about it.
I'll just really quickly say that it's one of these comics that it asks the reader to participate really actively. So, and if you have a young reader, or if you're a young reader who's just beginning to read comics, it helps you to think a lot about the clues that comics creators will give you to figure out which panel to read first and then which one to read next. This is a really intricate comic in which Jimmy, little Jimmy, kid detective, tries to figure out where his friend's missing science project has gone because it's due in a couple of hours, and he's very stressed about it's gone missing in some way. And you're told by the narrator as you start to work through, you have these wonderful instructions about following these little yellow arrows. And it's one of those things where if you follow the arrow in one direction, the story plays out one way. If you follow it in another, it plays out in another way. In fact, Andy, I got to the point where I was almost going to go and photocopy this on my office's photocopy machine and then cut out each of the panels and figure out all the different permutations and what they looked like for Jason Shiga, who created this, what it must have looked like when he first sort of plotted this comic. So it's not only funny in terms of what happens in the comic, but I really liked that it almost teaches how to read a comic.
It really does. And Gwen, I think back to those choose your own adventure stories, and it's kind of like those that we read as kids and kids still read, but it's with a comic format. And, it starts out really, really, really pretty easy. And it reminds me also of another book that Jason Shiga did a few years back called Meanwhile, which again starts very easy, but it gives the reader the option of choosing between one of two things. And then if you follow the arrows, and we should tell listeners that sometimes the arrows go off the page and on to the next page. So it can be a little bit tricky to see exactly where everything is going. But you do get to choose, there's one of two places where you can go, and you get to choose, and then on that page there's something to choose. So it kind of goes on and on and on. But every time you choose a certain path, you get to see, there's another path that I didn't take. So this is the type of story that you could read several times, and each time you could go into a different explore a different part of it.
Yeah, and let's just say that some really interesting characters emerge as the story unfolds. We won't give away anything more than that, but there's a point at which I must admit I was really amused and sort of wishing that my lunch had been as exciting back in school as these kids' lunches apparently appear to be. I don't know where they're going to school, but I would have liked to have gone there.
I would too. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And Gwen, this is I mean, it was I think both of our favorite stories. It's a fun story. It's a challenging story too. It's a story that some kids, maybe young readers, might have a little bit of trouble with, might be a little bit frustrating. But I would encourage them to try it and to stick with it. And I think once you get into that groove of actually choosing where the story's going to go, you'll really enjoy it.
Yeah, I agree. And, one other thing I think I'll mention, just in terms of the look of this comic, even though we have a number of different comics creators participating, and I should say that we do have also Snoopy and Lunchtime Beagle. Which is also in this that I don't think you mentioned, but is sort of cool because it's sort of the Snoopy characters. But everything, the color palette is consistent throughout the comic. So there's a color palette of white, black, and this lovely color of orange not orange, it's sort of an orangey yellow would be the best way to say it. And it was interesting to me to see the way that the different comics creators chose to use that color palette. I really like the way Cece Bell did and her crazy little thing called Lunch, which is about this young girl who has a crush on one of her classmates. And it turns out to be quite amusing, but also somewhat serious. There's some serious things that happen in it. But she really, more than almost anyone, uses that orange color to great effect. There's a lot of things that show up in there, like a bologna sandwich, mustard, and things like that are well suited to that color. And so I'll also mention it's really a beautiful book to look at, and it's fun to see the different choices that comics creators made.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that story too, because Crazy Little Thing Called Lunch by Cece Bell is one of my favorite stories in there. And the plot of that, Gwen, is something that we probably all went through at school. And the main character's name is Ellie, and she's the same thing for lunch every day. She's very regimented. And while she'd like to change her lunch routine, she's afraid that something crazy might happen. But then, like you said, when she sees that boy that she's got a crush on, she really, really likes him, and he's selling chocolate bars for the drama club. And she thinks, well, maybe I could change things just a little bit, and things do get crazy. But I think it's so good to show kids that lots of kids do like their routine, but their routines in school and lunch. But this comic shows them and us that a lot of times our fears are just silly things that are holding us back from something that might really be good and fun.
Yeah, and I'll say another thing that's very common to this time period in our lives, and that is food being used as something other than nutrition or to eat. There's a lot of projectile food in this series. And that's what I was talking about with mustard, because when I was in middle school, I don't know how the kids managed to do this, because I myself to this day have trouble opening up those little packets of ketchup and mustard. I almost always manage either to get it all over myself, or I can't get it open. It's like that thing where if you pick it up and you quickly open it, it works. But then if that doesn't happen, you're sitting there and then someone else comes along and they open it up so easily.
Yeah, it's so frustrating.
It is. Well, kids in my middle school used to actually slam their fist down on those and send the condiment up to the ceiling, and then it would drip down. So if you looked at the ceiling of our middle school classroom, or our lunch table or whatever, lunchroom or whatever, you would see it was almost like being in a cavern, but what was sticking down was actual mustard and ketchup. There's a lot of that goes on in this book. Oh, yeah. So I'm glad to know I wasn't the only one who went to a school where things like pudding, don't end up on you or something. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun, kind of squishy, gross type of stuff going on in the book. But I was surprised at how much history is in this book, because we've got a story about we got a story called Lucy and Andy Neanderthal Cave Soup by Jeffrey Brown, which is about a group of Neanderthal kids 40,000 years ago, and it gives a whole new meaning to the expression "finding something to eat."
Yes.
So, yeah. So we got a little history there, and we've got Baby Mouse and the Baby Mouse story, Lunch Table Champion. We got like a group of cats that take over the lunch table from Baby Mouse, and her friends have had a history lesson on medieval England and the whole caste system. And it's fun because the cats challenge Baby Mouse and their friends to a game of dodgeball for the rights to the lunch table. So there's a little bit of history thrown in there too, which is fun. But I think the biggest historical thing has to come from a story called Lunch Bomb 1943 by Nathan Hale.
Right.
And that's a fun story because it's how potatoes won an important battle in World War II.
I loved that. It was so funny. And you know what I love about those comics is that at the end, there are all these resources that you can use to look up all the historical facts that are mentioned in the comic itself. So I liked having a little bit of realism interspersed with the Neanderthals and the other sort of sci-fi things that happen in some of these stories. And of course, there's Snoopy too, which Snoopy, I can't help but to love Snoopy. And let's just say that Snoopy, I would not want him working at my pancake breakfast fundraiser.
No, we would not want that.
We will just leave it at that.
But yeah, these are a lot of fun. The Nathan Hale story now, if readers have never read a Nathan Hale story, this is actually a really good introduction because it's while it's one of the longer stories in this book, it's much shorter than one of his graphic novels, which usually focuses on a particular war, either in part or in whole. I mean, this is just a story about one small battle of World War II, and again, this is kind of like the Jason Shiga book story. For really, really young readers, it might challenge them, but actually it challenges them in a good way, especially kids that don't think that history is fun, because Nathan Hale really does know how to make history come alive.
Right, and the story is so amazing. That's all I really want to say because I don't want to spoil it for readers. Mm-hmm. But it was a very fascinating story, and the fact that it's true makes it even more sort of moving and interesting. So I think that young readers will really enjoy that.
I think so too. And the other stories that we haven't mentioned there is one called Pickput and Cullen in Worst Day Ever by Castellucci and Veron. And that's about a boy and a girl who don't like each other, but they're forced to work together on a school project. And, that happens all the time when you're in elementary school or middle school. You have to do this project with somebody that you can't stand.
Oh, it happens in college, too. Yeah. Whenever I announce a group project, I hear that groan from my students. So it never ends, really, does it?
No, it doesn't. And it keeps happening in the adult world too. So.
Yeah.
But that's a really fun story. I really, really like how the artwork is kind of goofy because the characters are kind of goofy, but it's humorous. But I like that a lot. And then the last story in the book, Lunch Girl and the Ominous Origin, is basically about trying to do the right thing during lunchtime. And one of Gwen, the saddest parts about lunchtime, especially if you're in a new school, is you go to lunch and a lot of times you're sitting by yourself,
right? Which
is just the worst. Or I guess the only thing that would be worse than that is having somebody sitting next to you that doesn't like you and is trying to spoil your lunch. And we won't say any more about that story, but it covers all of those bases.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I noticed was just the incredible variety of stories in terms of tone and in terms of subject matter. Even though they all deal with lunch in some way, there's enough variety that I think any child would find this fascinating. And it's the kind of comic, because it's an anthology, you can read one or two stories and then come back and you won't have lost your place. So I think for beginning comics readers, it would be a really great choice.
I think so too. And I think even for readers that might be reluctant readers, parents want their kids to read a little bit more than they're currently reading. This is the perfect thing because, like you said, the stories are short, they're fun. You can pick it up, put it down, and it's just a lot of fun.
And who doesn't really relate to dealing with issues involving lunch?
Right. Yeah. There's a fun little thing called Mashup Madness. This is kind of a goofy thing, and there's some other things in between the stories. And I really like this at the end, toward the end of the book. There is a write your own origin story. That's after the lunch lady story.
Right.
And it gives kids a chance to draw their own comic. And the comic, it gives you a little bit to work with, and there's a text that says, "It was an ordinary day at blank school." And then it gives the reader some space to draw something. "But that was the day that our lunch lady served my favorite lunch, and it gave me," and then the next panel is superpowers. And then there's more panels for you to draw, like what happened in there. And on the next page is really cool because it's got another one of the Holmes creations is Squish. And actually, Lunch Lady is talking to Squish and says, "Hey, Squish, you want to learn how to draw Baby Mouse?" And it actually shows young readers how to actually draw a comic. I mean, it's not in any detail, but it's enough to get you started. And so there's a lot of little fun stuff in there like that, too.
And I like the back. There's a warning. It says, "This book may cause excessive laughter and possible silliness. No assembly required. Dancing sandwich not included."
Yeah, that's right. And also too, there's information about the creators, and we have named some of the other books that these creators have done, but there's also more there if readers want to explore on their own. There's more things to explore.
This would make the perfect gift for any kid, really. And if you're trying to introduce a child to comics and to a number of really prominent current comics creators for kids, this is a great volume for that.
It really is. Unfortunately, this volume does not appear on DCB Service or in stock trades, but you can probably get it at lots of other stores or get it online. It's only $7.99, and for $7.99, you really get a lot of comic.
Absolutely. It's well worth the price. It was a lot of fun. I was reading it actually in public, which is always a big mistake. When you're reading something that either makes you laugh out loud or makes you cry, that. I mean, this one made me laugh, obviously. I always seem to be somewhere public, like sitting in an airplane or in a coffee shop. And with this one, I just was laughing and giggling throughout the whole thing. I kind of probably amused some of my fellow diners because I was really enjoying it that much. So I really recommend it.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun. And if you like the Comic Squad books, you might also like another series that is an anthology series, and it's called the Explorer series. And this is edited by Kazu Kubishi. I think I'm saying that right. And this is a different type of anthology series for young readers that's full color. It's a little bit more science fiction and fantasy based. But again, this is another good anthology if you have a reader that really, really likes Comic Squad and wants to read another good comics anthology. And Gwen, there's I can't think of too many anthology graphic novels for young readers besides Explorer and the Comic Squad. Are you aware of any other ones?
No, I know a number of series, for instance,
Yeah.
But as far as anthologies, not so. Well, yes, actually, I do.
Okay.
The Toon series that's done by Art Spiegelman and Francis Mouly.
Yeah.
But again, those are usually collections of older comics for kids, but they are very supportive of that kind of thing too. So if you'd like to introduce your child reader to some of the more traditional comics that maybe you knew as a child or your parents did, the Toon Treasury is wonderful.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I completely missed that one. So great call.
I try.
Yeah. All right. Well, Gwen, would you like to move ahead to the second book that we're going to talk about today?
Absolutely. We are talking about Dare to Disappoint, Growing Up in Turkey, which is the first graphic novel by Özge Samanci, an artist and professor at Northwestern University who grew up in Izmir, Turkey on the Aegean Sea during the 1980s and 1990s. This text is published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and it has been designated for readers aged 14 and above, and I do want to talk about that for a second. Compared to many popular text-only YA novels, I think that Dare to Disappoint contains some allusions to violence and sexuality, but for the most part, the memoir chronicles the cultural, familial, and intellectual influences that combine to form Samanci's path to becoming an artist. I do want to say up front that one of the most moving and visually complicated scenes in the comic occurs when Samanci narrowly escapes assault by two men on the grounds of her university campus. This scene, combined with a couple of highly stylized depictions of political violence, are what undoubtedly earned the comic a 14 and up designation. But again, for the most part, Dare to Disappoint focuses on coming-of-age conflicts that would be highly familiar to most young people aged 10 or older. So if you're a parent listening to this and thinking about whether the comic is right for your child, obviously only you know your child. But I will say that, comparatively speaking, this text seems no different than most YA texts that are published and that are read by kids. It is truly a coming-of-age novel, which means that we start with the protagonist when she's just wanting to sort of be in school. She's about 4 years old, and she's very desperate to start school, and it concludes when she finishes college. So some of the topics that are handled in the especially last third of the novel would be, more the things that teenagers realistically deal with when they're in high school and college. But again, I think it's a wonderful book, and every subject it treats, I think, with respect and care. So, go ahead, Andy.
No, I was just going to say, I like that when I first started reading the book, Gwen, I thought because Özge starts out as a very young girl in the book with her sister, and I would say a significant part of the book, she's a young girl. And so it almost seems like this would be a comic for younger readers, because we spend so much time with her as a little girl. But I think that it's really important, and I like the way Özge lays down that foundation, because we learn what her life is like, we learn what her school is like, and we learn what the people around her are like, as far as the family, the community, and the nation. We learn a lot about that. We learn also about, Özge's parents, her mom was an artist, and her father was, he taught technical drawing. Is that what?
That's correct, yeah.
And so, and it's interesting because the way the book addresses what females can do with their lives. In fact, it says in there were only two possibilities: a singer on TV, or there was one other possibility, a belly dancer. So, you look at that and we laugh, but, the possibilities really, really were limited. And a good bit of this book is examining, how girls in that atmosphere, how they grew up, what their choices were, what people were telling them, people from their parents all the way up to, military leaders, government leaders. And, this is a really, really eye-opening book about what Özge's life was like as she grows and develops and tries to decide, what am I going to do with my life?
Right. And the title Dare to Disappoint, I think, is one we might want to think about for a moment, because it really deals with a young person's attempt to figure out what they want in a world where so many people have an opinion about what they should do. And central to that certainly is the relationship that Samanci has with her parents. The chapter Istanbul provides the first sustained information that readers learn about Ahmet, her father, including the fact that he was an orphan and a self-made man. In a Chicago Tonight interview that Samanci did recently to promote her book, I should say Chicago Tonight is a PBS program. It's quite good, and the video is available online. We'll put the link on our show for you to that. But she talks about how in the Turkey of her youth, being an orphan was considered to be a shameful status, and she notes that her father worked extremely hard not only to overcome this status, but to ensure that his two daughters would be set for life. And that's a phrase that all of us have heard at least once or twice, I'm sure, in our own lives. he wants them to become engineers, the one career that virtually guaranteed a woman a solid financial status. And it was born out of the fear that his children would suffer the loneliness and the struggles that he had endured. But as is so often the case, Samanci shows how this very well-meaning desire ends up putting her into another kind of danger, the danger of missing out on what she views to be her own true calling, ultimately that of an artist. To be fair, though, Mr. Samanci is a strong supporter of his children and their access to education. So even though, she's growing up in a culture where women's roles are somewhat circumscribed, her father actually is a major advocate for her. And in fact, there's a lovely scene in the text where, she has tried to make a stand for fairness, and she's disciplined by her principal, and her father comes in and basically very solemnly defends her, but then later walks with her through a park, and he says to her that in order to succeed, she must become invisible and she must toe the line, and of course the fact that we're holding this memoir in our hand and it's a beautiful work of art suggests that she didn't do that, but she depicts her father as a very complicated person. The only really full page spread in the entire text is devoted to a portrait of her father and a description of his background. And so she treats her parents respectfully, but she also demonstrates how very often their protectiveness or their deep desire for their children not to experience pain can paradoxically sometimes lead to that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. We didn't really say anything about the way I do want to get back to some of the thematic things that are going on, but the book is laid out in a kind of a unique way. There's a lot of mixed media and collage going on,
right?
Especially in the chapter headings, and the story is kind of a fluid storytelling because we don't have panels like we traditionally have in a comic book or a graphic novel. There really are no borders, although it is easy to figure out, which picture and which picture to go to next. I mean, they sort of are panels, but they just aren't bordered.
Right, and she uses sight lines a lot in that, right, so that a character will be looking at something or a line will be drawn from one sort of roughly drawn panel to another. So it's not that it's a difficult comic to read. Right,
yeah, it's definitely not difficult, but I really like the way that color is used, especially to show like when cultural differences or when one of the really important things in the book is when Western influences start becoming more and more frequent in Turkey. And one of my favorite parts is where the author's talking about Greek television had 2 channels instead of Turkey's 1, and they also had more cartoons. And then one of the characters says, "Our enemies love kids more than the Turks do." So you've got all these Western influences seeping into the culture, and that is another point of contention with certain people in the story, and that's another one of the things that Özge is trying to come to terms with, all these cultural differences. But for us as American readers, there's certain things in the book that seem a little strange to us, but they're not really unapproachable. Because, we want the same things that the characters in the book want. We want to have an identity. We want to have friends. We want to succeed in life. We want to follow our own dreams. And I think this book will resonate with just about anybody, even though it is about a different country, about a different culture. This book needs to be read by lots of people.
Yeah, and I would also say that one of the things I found interesting about the political commentary and the historical background that appears in this text is it provided for me a new way of understanding a part of the world that I didn't know that much about prior to this. In fact, one of the things I liked in chapter 4, which is called Welcome to the Land of Heroes, Samanci depicts the way that she experiences a gradual understanding of what it means to grow up in a country that is ostensibly a secular democracy, but that is run primarily by the military. Mm-hmm. She also begins to contrast the official history that she's learning in school from her teachers especially regarding, say, the conflict with Turkish and sort of Greek forces over Cyprus, which is going on when she's in school, with the true complexities of that relationship that are put forward to her by her mom. It's interesting to me, Andy, in part because in the neighborhood I grew up in, Flint, I lived right next door to and with a number of immigrants from Greece and Macedonia. And as a little girl, one of my neighbors, Teta Luba, used to babysit me. And she would feed me baklava and wonderful food. But in between, she would tell me stories, and some of those stories were placed individuals of Turkish descent in a very negative light because she had grown up in the midst of certain conflicts between the Greeks and the Turks. Mm-hmm. And obviously, as I grew up, I made Turkish friends. I read more about the country and its history, and I developed a more rounded understanding of Turkey. But I found this graphic novel to be really illuminating in the same way that, say, Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis was, in terms of helping me gain a greater understanding for life in Iran during the 1980s and 1990s. And in that instance, because Iran has been such a closed culture, it was super eye-opening. And so I would say that what this text does for me in a way is it on the one hand shows the way that young people, regardless of what country they grow up in or what culture they grow up in, have to struggle to understand the world around them and to make sense of it. And I think this text does a beautiful job of that. But it also was very illuminating for me, and I'm sure it would be for other readers, in learning about a culture that's very much like ours in some ways. Turkey is a founding member of a number of the political organizations internationally that the U.S. is part of. But it also has a very complicated past because of its geographic location as the crossroads of a number of different cultures. And I thought that this book handled it beautifully. And one of the things, I don't know if you found this really interesting too, but one of the central characters in the text is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic in the 1920s. Whose emphasis on secular democracy combined with paternalism made him a national hero. In fact, in that interview on Chicago Tonight, Samanci talks about him almost being viewed as a god by children. His portrait is everywhere, and there's a wonderful spread where she shows like every single place she goes, he's looking at her. Right. And, just as Marjan Satrapi engages in conversations with God in Persepolis, Özge confides her worries and desires to a portrait of Ataturk, and of course later to a portrait of Jacques Cousteau, whom she comes to view as sort of her liberator in a lot of really fascinating ways. So there are a lot of cultural reference here that may be unusual or unfamiliar to North American readers, but there are other ones like that of Jacques Cousteau, who, at least from my generation and maybe yours too, he was considered to be such a brave individual, and she looks to him for in some ways an alternative way of being. And so this text is really lovely in that respect. You learn about history, but it's so engagingly drawn, and it's in these political comments and arguments that occur out in the world that may be confusing for us oftentimes get illuminated when Özge goes home and talks to her parents, and then we read their take on it as well. So you're getting a variety of voices that come forward in the text as well, which I liked.
I liked it too, and I agree with you that there's so much here, even though we're reading a story about people in a different culture, but there's so many things that we have in common. There's this huge pressure on both the girls to succeed, to do well in school, and the education system in Turkey is quite different from the one that we have here, but in some ways it's not. That you want to try to go to the best school that you can. That may involve being in a boarding school, it may involve travel, but there's a certain amount of pressure to do well. And of course, kids here still have that, depending on what situation that you're in. And even if you don't have that pressure, you want to do well. You want to get out of maybe a bad situation to get in a better situation. And we see this, Samanci writes about this and about the choices that we make in our lives, the choices that other people have made for us, and ultimately, how do we fulfill our dreams and satisfy the people who want us to do well too, but may have a different dream for us.
Right. And it also becomes that conflict that I think all of us face who have choices about what we do for an occupation, of whether or not we're going to take the safe route or take the daring route. And, it's interesting because part of the trauma that Samanci goes through in her adolescence is that she really does try to, as she says, tick off all the boxes that are expected of her. But ultimately, that cookie cutter kind of life is something that she just has a lot of trouble being true to herself and pursuing. And I think it's really, I don't want to give away too much for our readers, but I think it's handled very beautifully at the end, the sort of forces that converge to help her understand not only what her calling is, but to give her the courage to pursue it.
I think so too. This is a great book for teenagers who are struggling with some of these things, and maybe your parents think, well, we would really like for you to be a doctor or whatever, and they have certain skills that they think are going to take them in a different direction. That happens all the time, and I think there's a lot of hope in this book, and I would hope that young readers, teenagers who read this, realize that everything doesn't have to be a certain way, that maybe things can work out better than it looks like things are going. Things might not look so good because of certain situations, but there's always hope, and I think this book would give people a lot of hope.
Yeah, and Samanci has said that this is the book she wished someone had handed her when she was 18. And whenever an author writes from that place, typically it's a good book. Because they really have thought through the conflicts and the issues in their life that were holding them back. And they end up writing not just to discuss their own experiences, but really to show, I think, other young people, look, you're not alone in having these questions. It's funny because when you hit middle age, as I have, your biggest conflict is, did I make the right choices? Mm-hmm. But in reading this book again, it brought me back to how I felt in my early 20s and when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. And it a lot of that sort of anxiety that we feel about trying to impress our parents or people we care about versus following what we really want to do, that sort of conflict came right back to me. And so there was a lot of realism in this text, and I thought it was beautifully drawn. We haven't really talked, I think, enough, though, about just how beautiful it is in terms of the imagery, the use of color, as you pointed out, and also just the sheer variety of ways that Samanci expresses the narrative. Because if readers have this in front of them, or once they get it, I would encourage them to turn to page 40, which I think is a really central page in the entire text. Poor Samanci is crying and upset because of something that's happened at school, and her sister hands her a beautiful ruler. And it's one that when I was a kid, I had one of these sorts of rulers, and maybe you did, Andy.
I did.
It's one of those clear, sort of almost see-through rulers that's about 3 inches by about 8 inches, and then the center are all these cutouts of shapes, so that it basically teaches kids how to draw perfect circles and squares and rectangles. And what's fascinating about this ruler, though, is that in addition to those shapes that we might expect to see, there's a silhouette of Ataturk's head. And the text reads, with this ruler, you can draw a perfect circle, triangle, square, Ataturk. Right. If you are going to draw Ataturk, you have to draw him right. Otherwise, you are in deep trouble. And in interviews, Samanci has said that this particular cookie cutter way of drawing Ataturk is a beautiful metaphor, she says, for the entire text, because it suggests in a way that if she were to follow what her society wanted her to do just perfectly, she wouldn't have ended up having the life that she had. Mm-hmm. But it's so beautiful because basically it's a photograph representation of the ruler, but then there's wonderful comics collage that's occurring on the page too, and it's one of dozens and dozens of pages where that collage effect is just so effective in terms of putting forward meaning. I love this book, actually. It's so beautiful to look at.
It really is. It's a wonder. And, every page is different. And although the style remains the same, Each page is unique. There are no two pages that are exactly alike. And there's so many different ways of visual storytelling going on here. There's so much of interest going on. And one of the simplest things that I like, I see an example of it on page 75. At the last, we would call it a panel, but Özge is talking with her one of her mom's friends, and she's asking her what she wants to be when she grows up, and she says, "Oh no, you'll have a real job, and you'll do swimming as a hobby." And then you see Özge just by herself, and then there's these blue lines, and she says, "A hobby?" And then you see something similar when one of her teachers on page 125 is giving her a hard time because she's not done well on some work, and she's trying to become a part of the theater community. And he says, "You will be judged by the discipline committee." And you see the same type of lines going out, but this time they're red. And it's just something so simple like that, but carries such weight to it.
And that repeats itself when she has an argument with her father about vocation, where these big blue lines, like scribbles that kids would do in a coloring book when they hadn't yet developed the fine motor skills to shade or whatever, coming out of her, and then the same red coming out of her father. So that repeated braid throughout the comic sort of draws attention to those very fraught conversations.
There's another wonderful motif that she uses throughout the book, and that is rejection and acceptance stamps. Because you did you love that? I love that.
I did.
There's certain stamps that you get, like either on your school work or at a job, and if you did a bad job, they just stamp reject on it. And if it's good, they'll stamp accept on it. And she's talking here about, she's got this pink ruler, and something happens that I'm not going to tell you about the ruler, but eventually Özge wants to get rid of the ruler, and she says there are 4 options: break it, reject; burn it, reject; purposefully lose it, reject; or learn how to live with it. Only choice, accept. And there's so many of those things throughout the book, and it gives you a sense of not only things that you have to do, but there's a certain hierarchy, a certain authority that's telling you no, reject, 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 accept. And that's what her whole life has been about, because that's the way that the culture is there. And that comes across so many times, and it's such a powerful tool. It's a very simple tool, but it's very powerful.
Yeah, and there's another motif that is this little bird who appears at various points, sometimes even the most serious points. There are some pages in this text that very much resemble Satrapi's depiction of torture under the Iranian regime, and they're very sobering. Mm-hmm. But what adds sort of almost humanizes it, ironically, is that a lot of the historical facts or background that you need are provided by this little bird. Mm-hmm. So on one page where the government is rounding up dissidents and torturing them, the little bird says left-wing people were liberals, socialists, and communists. Right-wing people were nationalists and conservatives. And it's sort of like these things that she was telling or reminding herself at the time, but also it's informative for readers now. And the little bird appears throughout the text. At first, I didn't realize it was a motif. I just thought that it was decorative, but then as you keep reading, you see that, no, it shows up at some pretty important times with some important information. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is this book is a feast for the eyes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it would be a great book to read with a younger reader, where a parent could sort of point some of these things out. It's another one of those comics that almost teaches you a lot about reading comics because of its layout.
Yeah, and the thing that I like about the bird motif that you mentioned, that and all of the other motifs, none of it is overdone. You don't see so much of the bird that you think, oh boy, here comes the bird. Yeah, right. Here's the bird again. So none of those things are overused, and I think that's what makes this book such a strong book, is because there's so much variety. Samanji's got so many tools at her disposal, and she's such a gifted artist and storyteller, and those things don't always go hand in hand. That this is just a wonderful book.
It makes me excited to see what she'll do next and this text has garnered a great deal of attention globally. It's been translated already into Dutch. Right now there are a number of companies, publishing companies in Turkey that are competing for the rights to publish it in Turkish. And I have a feeling that it's one of those texts that reminds me so much of Satrapi and Persepolis. But that doesn't mean to say that it's not original in its own right, because it really is. Samanci has a very unique voice, and she's talking about a somewhat different culture. But in both cases, you see the culture through the eyes of a young child, and as that child grows up, you yourself as the reader really begin to sort of match that character's level of sophistication of understanding of the culture, because the more that she understands and can articulate, the more you can as a reader too. I found it to be a wonderful window onto a world that I really didn't know that much about, and it's leaving me wanting to know more. And I think that's the highest praise you can have about something, because I started off not really knowing very much, and by the end, really wanting to go to Turkey, honestly, and learn more and read more as well. And so I'm really pleased that Samanci came out with this book.
I'm also pleased that a major publisher picked this up, because this is published by Farrar, Straus Giroux, which is a huge publisher, and it's hopefully this is something that's going to get in the hands of a lot of people, and like you said, a lot of teens. I hope that they read it, and a lot of adults read it too, and I hope they read it together.
Yeah, and this really is an all-ages comic. It's really, I think, the first comic that we've done, Andy, that was written primarily for, I would say, if not an adult audience, at least an older audience, and yet features, as you said, such a heavy emphasis on the early coming-of-age experiences of the character. And that's exciting, too, because I love those comics that cross over, where both young people and adults can enjoy them, and that certainly is the case here.
I would agree. Well, Gwen, we've talked about two really, really great comics today. Unfortunately, these two are not available right now at DCB Service or their sister company In Stock Trades, but you will find a lot of great other titles there. And when you do go there, you're going to see some huge discounts. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of these books. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com, and on the right-hand side of your browser, you'll see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or, if you want to go old school, after lunch at school, you'll probably get in trouble. But you can call us on the telephone at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can contact us by email. Maybe you have a comment or a question. We love questions. You can contact us at the number 2guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Wolverton at comicsalternative.com. And Gwen?
Well, Andy, I can be reached at Gwen at comicsalternative.com, but you can also find us on Twitter, where we announce our new content to our podcasts and update to our blog. We are at 2guys with PhDs.
That's right. And you can also find us in a lot of other places. We're on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, and Pinterest. And we even have a YouTube channel. So you can check us out there. You can also subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. And you can discover every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary on our blog at comicsalternative.com. Well, Gwen, we've really covered a couple of really, really cool books today. Yeah, these were just a lot of fun.
It's a pleasure as always. And anything that there's lots of lovely food in both of these books that are mentioned. And so, I think I'm going to go off and find myself a nice lunch now.
That sounds good to me. Well,
all right.
Next time we'll be back with more new books. And until then, I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen. And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.